Welcome to tonight's edition of The Probe. So despite being able to restructure only, $1.6 billion out of more than $30 billion external debt, Ghana expects International Monetary Fund board approval for its $3 billion support program latest by May. And that's according to Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta just last week. He's been making a crucial pitch with an assurance to the investor community of Ghana's commitment to restoring economic stability through effective implementation of this particular support program. We'll also be hearing from the managing director of the IMF, who is meanwhile saying she will personally intervene to enable Ghana reach a deal with her creditors. But what is Ghana doing to help itself is the key question for many. Tonight we probe Ghana's IMF Quest, the spring meeting verdict. We're live from Joy News here in Accra. On radio, we are on Joy 99.7 FM. We are also on a number of affiliates across Ghana's 16 regions. We're on myjoyonline.com and all social media platforms. You can tweet at us with the hashtag #TheProbe. I am Emefa Apawu, and Ghana's Information Minister Kojo Ponkroma joins us live from Washington, D.C., Ghana's office at the IMF Headquarters Building 1, joining us live tonight on The Probe. Please do join us with your thoughts, your comments as well. You're very much welcome, especially those nagging questions, so that the Information Minister can provide answers to them. A quick turnaround, then we dig deeper into the issues. Please stay with me.
Just keep at it. And we have goodwill all around. I think we have negotiated in good faith with the fund, with the Paris Club, and now began with external investors, bondholders. And I expect that, the ship will be brought to port in good order. And really to thank Ghanaians for the forbearance, very difficult time for all of us. But I think we are charting a course that will make our country a lot stronger.
Mr. Grateful, the delegation is led by the Minister for Finance, supported by the Minister of State, the Governor, and the Deputy Governor are also leading the Bank of Ghana's teams that are part of the delegation. You see the directors of the Ministry of Finance as well. So, Mr. we're grateful to you and the team. Colleagues, we're grateful. Minister,
we have worked very hard and very swiftly to have the program for Ghana, $3 billion support program for Ghana in place. We have been urging Ghana's creditors to act swiftly. My appreciation for also the proactive role of the Minister of Finance of Ghana in reaching out to creditors. We are expecting that next week there will be discussions among creditors, and I can tell you that I use every opportunity myself to urge them to act swiftly. Let's remember that Ghana for a long time has done really well to tap markets to finance its growth path. It has been like all innocent bystanders hit by COVID, hit by the war in Ukraine, and it has complicated domestically the ability to finance the budget. So a country that has long track record of sound macroeconomic management ought to be supported to return to markets. So our program is a bridge for Ghana, and to tell you the truth, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think Ghana is going to move. The creditors are going to move, and we are going to move swiftly. So I guess the short answer to you is stay tuned and stay positive.
Managing Director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva there, welcoming us back to tonight's edition of The Probe. Information Minister Kojo Nkrumah is on the other end, joining us live from Washington. So it's a good time to start talking. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Pleasure to have you on The Probe. Maybe we would have to try and see if we can hear you, Mr. Nkrumah. You would have to unmute, Mr. Nkrumah. Okay, it appears he's unable to hear us. Mr. Nkrumah, can you hear me? Maybe we'll try again if you can hear me, Mr. Nkrumah.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
I don't know. I'm sure that will be resolved. If we will be good. So let's start off. We know that the spring meeting for this year is ending today. It started from the 10th to the 16th. A number of issues have come up that we'll be digging deeper into. A number of questions we have. But let's talk about how it's been so far for the Ghanaian team.
Can you hear me, Emefa? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Mr. Nkrumah.
Thank you. I think first we should put in context what the spring meetings are about. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have two meetings a year. They are the spring meetings and then they are the annual meetings somewhere in October. Both meetings give the various members an opportunity to converge around and interrogate some of the emerging issues in individual economies and in the global economic space. So the spring meetings generally have afforded members of the fund and the World Bank Group an opportunity to interrogate the various issues that are going on globally in terms of global economies. But on the sides of the spring meetings, we've also been having a number of meetings with the fund. Yesterday, we had a meeting with the managing director of the fund herself, with our external creditors, with investors in Ghana, both on the market side and then in terms of FDIs and a number of other groups. But I think generally the testimony is that it's been a good set of meetings. And what remains now is how to appropriate the benefits from all of these meetings.
Okay. Well, we understand that the Ghana team is going to meet these external creditors, the Paris Club. That's the Partial Creditors Committee that was set up. We understand it's this week to try and secure some financial assurances. Is that the case?
There have been a number of meetings already, and there will be some more meetings. And these meetings, as I mentioned, have been fruitful so far, giving both the fund on one side and then the sovereign Ghana on the other side the confidence that things are moving in accordance with our expectations.
And what's the status of China as we speak in terms of getting that required financial assurance from them?
The feedback that we have is that the minister's trip to China, I think last month or early April, yielded positive results. And the Chinese authorities are going through their administrative or their bureaucratic systems to be able to respond to us formally on that. But the indications that we are picking on that are very, 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 very positive. Okay.
Well, but one key issue that keeps coming up once we decided to, when we put out the flyer that we're speaking to you, the key concern for some, one of the key questions that runs through was what actually was then the tipping point? For which reason we are knocking on the doors of the IMF again? What really was it? Panic? What kind of assessment was done when we were sure that that was not going to happen?
I think that's a very fair question. Let's go back to when the announcement was made. July 1, 2022. The government announcement under my hand essentially said that, one, having followed the developments, the economic developments, the government of Ghana had come up with an enhanced domestic program to turn around the Ghanaian economy. That was number one. And that number two, the program will require some balance of payment support, BOP support, from the International Monetary Fund. And therefore, the president had instructed the minister responsible for finance to start engagement with the fund in pursuance of this balance of payment support. And I think it's very, very important to refresh everybody's memory that the big answer to the resolution of our economic challenges lies in the hands of the government of Ghana and the people of Ghana. That big answer is within the framework of what we call the Enhanced Domestic Program, or which has been technically named as the PCPEG, the Post-COVID Program for Economic Recovery.
Now, within that program, you require financing. And that financing will come from a combination of about 3 sources: domestic resources, balance of payment support because we don't have access to the international capital markets, and then you also require some of our development partners to come in. And that's where, you talk of the financing assurances that will come in from the development partners. Now, what was the tipping point? The tipping point came when Ghana literally was denied access to the international capital markets, because to finance our budget and to finance our economy, you need cedi and hard currency. No matter the amount of cedis that you have, if you have external obligations that are due in dollars, for example, you cannot pay those external obligations with cedis. If you owe Citibank, or you owe the Chinese, or you owe the Americans, you cannot pay that with cedi. So you need to work on your cedi financing of your economic program, but you also need to be able to access the currency market so that you have access to hard currency for that. Now, remember that a number of things happened that denied Ghana access to the international capital markets. And I'm answering your question about the tipping point. Number one was that because of what had happened with COVID, primarily, we had to resort to borrowing that we had not planned for. And it brought our debt levels beyond sustainable limits. Sometimes when you hear government officials or economists argue that COVID played a major part in our problem, people like to dismiss it, that, they are just blaming somebody. But the reality, and as we came and all other economies are giving their numbers, the reality is that countries had to borrow a lot during COVID because economies went down and they needed to finance a lot of the interventions. So we had to resort to a lot of borrowing. The borrowing pushed many economies, including Ghana, beyond a certain limit. Now, once that happens, the credit rating agencies really don't care about the cause of why you have borrowed to a certain level. They will give a verdict. And the verdict they gave was that our debt had reached a particular level, and therefore, in terms of credit ratings, they were going to downgrade our credit ratings. That quickly becomes a signal to other potential investors and lenders who would have ordinarily invested hard currency in your economy. And once those credit ratings came, then you could not access the international capital markets because they had more or less issued a warning to everybody that Ghana's debt had reached a particular level. Never mind what caused it, but Ghana's debt reached a particular level. Now, at that warning point, you won't get new inflow of dollars. It's only your reserves that you are now depending on to meet all your obligations, such as buying fuel on the international market, importing essential medicines, importing essential items into the Ghanaian economy. You are now relying on just your reserves. You are not necessarily earning or bringing in new dollars because they have issued a warning, and therefore investors are skeptical of investing into the Ghanaian economy in terms of market investors. So you don't have access to the capital markets. That became the tipping point. Now the point at which the president said, while we have a big program, the fund remains one of the only places where you can get access to the international capital markets or get access to an inflow of forex to show up the program that you want to run. And that was the point at which on the 1st of July, the president caused that engagement to start, and we've been working on it so that we can primarily get access to the capital market. Because if you don't, as demand rises for example, the dollar, and supply of the dollar is limited, the price of the dollar will go up. That is what you call depreciation of your currency. And once depreciation sets in, even if the price of the item on the global market has not changed, the price in Ghana will go up because now it's being bought with a more expensive, cedi. And that then culminates into your cost of living challenges that you're having. So that became the tipping point. That was the point that the president made that decision, and we've been acting on his instructions since then.
Then what's the confusion with the timelines that has been communicated over the period? Started off March ending, now we've ended at May. We're told, even that, we don't really know if that is really a concrete assurance that you're giving us. What's really the confusion?
Again, I think that's a very, very important question. So let's start with the timelines. The very first timeline that was mentioned from July last year was that we expected to use 6 months to complete negotiations for a staff level agreement, so that by the end of the year, we'll have a staff level agreement. I remember, and I think if I recall, I was in your studios on one of these shows when questions were coming in, and a lot of commentary was coming into the fact that it is not possible to conclude a staff level agreement within 6 months. To the glory of God, the Republic of Ghana was able to conclude the staff level agreement before 31st December last year. So that timeline was not missed. The second timeline that was given was that having concluded the staff level agreement, we need to complete the prior actions so that our agreement can be taken to the IMF board for board approval by the end of March. Now, those prior actions are not actions that the government or the executive branch suo motu can execute. The government on its own cannot finish all of those prior actions. You need other people to come together to work with you to meet those prior actions. One of those prior actions, for example, was about the passage of some 3 revenue bills in Parliament. And you know that no matter how the executive branch pushes through, you will still need the collaboration of Parliament to be able to pass those, especially in a Parliament where you have a number of, say, 136 to 138. You need, for example, to put in place a debt restructuring program, domestic and external. The domestic may be within your contemplation, but you recall that you cannot force anybody. It's a voluntary exercise that people have to participate in. And if you are not getting the participation and you're having to roll down the dates some more, give extensions, it affects the timeline that you have given. You have external creditors that you have to talk to, those in the Paris Club and those outside the Paris Club, China, India, Saudi Arabia, etc. All of that is not exactly within your domain. But be that as it may, we give ourselves a timeline of by the end of March. We should have been able to finish with these prior actions so that we'll be ready to get board approval. Today is the 16th of April, if I'm correct. That's about 2 weeks since March ended. So it is that timeline that has not materialized at this point in time. Thankfully, all of that work has now been completed. And if you heard the IMF managing director herself, and I think you played her insert, she is clear in her mind that Ghana has fulfilled what we need to fulfill and that they can now go to the board and get us board approval. And to quote her, she said, stay tuned and I think keep hope alive or something.
But that also depends largely on our external creditors that she mentions as well. So that really is out of our control. So we are sure that this May timeline would be the timeline that we are really going to achieve what we set out to achieve.
I think the feedback is that our engagement with the external creditors has been very positive so far. I mentioned to you that, first of all, those in the Paris Club have had very positive sentiments to express about the kind of work that the people of Ghana and the government of Ghana have been able to do so far. Those outside the Paris Club, China, India, Saudi, have also given us very positive sentiments. And I've also given those very positive sentiments to the fund. Okay. It is all of that that we expect to come together in the coming set of weeks so that those financing assurances can be issued by the external sovereign creditors. And the fund, having received those assurances, can then proceed to the board.
Well, we'll get into the questions, but one key issue, since we are talking about the debt exchange program as well, let's talk about the total fiscal savings that government has been able to make out of this domestic debt exchange program. I'm sure we can give us some understanding of where we are and what we are hoping to use it for, how the utilization plan, if there is any.
So let me talk about the utilization plan first, and then I'll answer your question about the numbers. The challenge or the fiscal challenge that the government is trying to deal with is that there are a number of expenditure commitments, including debt servicing. The debt servicing expenditure commitments are based on contracts that were signed with creditors a while back, over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. You sign a contract with a creditor and you say, give me $10 million. I will pay you over this period at this interest rate. So every year I'll service this percentage of it. So you have contracts. You put all of those contracts into one basket and it becomes your debt servicing part of your expenditure commitments. Then you have the, the government operations. So you have item 1, which is compensation. Then you have goods and services. You have capital expenditure. Then you have debt servicing before you get to amortization, etc. So the debt servicing component is based on prior contracts that you have signed. Now, the forecast is that if you look at the revenues that are coming in and you compare to these expenditure commitments, government has a difficulty in servicing these expenditure commitments.
What's the difficulty? What's the difficulty exactly?
Because the revenues that are coming in. So, for example, if your forecast of revenues is, let's say, 100 billion, and then based on the expenditure commitments that you have made, your expenditure commitments are 130 billion. You then have a gap of 30 billion. So you ask yourself, how much can I prudentially borrow this year? Maybe it's 20 billion. So in addition to your 100 billion, assuming you meet your revenue target of 100 billion, you can only borrow about 20 billion in addition. But you have expenditure commitments of 130 billion. So the prudent thing to do is to go to that 130 billion and say, how do I make some adjustments or cuts to free up some fiscal space of about 10 billion so that at least you balance your budget? So one of the instruments is to have a conversation with the creditors that you've signed contracts with in times past and say, can we change the terms of the contract so that maybe out of that 130 billion, your obligation to creditors is 30 billion. Can we adjust the contract so that it's no longer 30 billion a year, but it's 20 billion a year? If we can adjust it, then by raising 100 billion, borrowing 20 billion, you can then honor the 120 billion obligations instead of the 130 billion obligations. So the conversation with creditors essentially was, or is, how do we adjust the old terms? How do we exchange some of the old debts for new debts at the new terms so that the government can honor its obligations? And that is the kind of conversation that has been going on. So the domestic side of it was aimed at helping the government to adjust its expenditure commitments to meet the revenues. That's number one. So it's not like there's going to be an alternate use for that money. Okay. It is commitment that you have, which if you look at the forecast, you can't meet. And therefore, you are having to adjust those commitments by exchanging the debts that underline those commitments for new debt. Sometimes you hear debt exchange, debt. It's a very simple enterprise of changing the old debts for new debts at terms that the government can honor. Now, your earlier question was about...
On the total fiscal savings, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so again, just a quick correction. There are no savings here. You are only just adjusting it year by year so that you can meet the obligations. To be honest with you, as at now, there are outstanding parts of that program. Remember, the cocoa bonds have not been dealt with. The dollar domestic bonds have not been dealt with. They are the outstanding parts that need to be completed. And then when all of those are settled, you have clarity of how much fiscal space you have been able to, cut out for this fiscal year, and if you program it for the subsequent fiscal year. So I will pray that we give the technocrats at the Ministry of Finance some time to finish with the cocoa bonds and then the dollar domestic bills. Then we'll get a clear sense of how much fiscal space, how much of that expenditure obligation this year, next year, the next 4 or 5 years has been, cut back as a result of this intervention.
Okay, but we have an idea of the level of the funding gap that our external creditors have to help out with. We have really an idea?
I don't want to prejudice the conversation, especially because of the financial assurances that are going on, because these are different currency, different countries, different currencies. Some may be willing to do more than the other. So I don't want to go into those numbers for now. I think we should just give them the room to finish and then issue the various levels of assurances, and then we can get into it.
Okay, well, let's bring in the audience questions as well. We have a number of them, so let's quickly run through them. Yeah, we are ready. We'll go through the first one. This is from Estinam. Do we have the financing assurances that we need yet? You've been touching a bit on it, but we'll go into it. Kay is also asking, how close would you say the government is in securing this particular deal? Susan is asking, would you say the negotiations are broken down between Ghana and the external creditors? Because why is the IMF managing director the one issuing urgent appeals to these creditors? Kwamina says, in terms of successes, do you believe the ongoing IMF World Bank Spring meeting has yielded any benefit for the country's quest to assess the IMF bailout? That has been touched on as well. Lord is asking, regarding the specifics, can you share exactly what is delaying the needed assurances, especially from China? So that's the first batch of questions. Yeah, we want to add more, or we'll take this one first? Okay, well, so let's go through this particular batch first, and then we can take more. So Esnam, you've been talking about it a bit, financing assurances that we need yet. So briefly, if you could add anything to that.
Financing assurances are expected from the external sovereigns, not necessarily the private lenders. So the sovereigns, i.e. the countries that, extend credit to us and do business with us. And then the development partners as well, as to how much they are willing or looking to, re-engage with Ghana on. Remember, I mentioned that the tipping point was because or when we lost access to the capital markets. So if you don't have access to the capital markets and other people are giving assurances that they will come through, how much is each person more or less contemplating? We are of the humble view that the kind of behind-the-scenes conversations that have gone on and the levels that are being spoken about, we will get those assurances pretty shortly.
Okay.
Indeed, if you want to see the strongest level of confidence, I would refer you to the IMF Managing Director's confidence that the kind of conversations that the fund is also having behind the scenes with our external partners gives them the confidence that those financing assurances will be coming through. And maybe I should just go back to the third question about have the talks broken down? If not, why is the IMF MD herself urgently asking countries or the external partners to come in? I think we should go back to her exact words. Maybe if we transcribe her words, we can see what she's saying. What she's saying is that she's been personally urging all of these countries to act swiftly because, and these are her words, not mine, Ghana is an innocent bystander that was hit, and that a country with a track record of sound economic management like this ought to be supported. Those are her words. You can play back for your audiences. Somebody may choose not to, hear those words, but say, oh, even the IMF MD is begging for Ghana. But listen to what she's saying. She's urging countries to act swiftly because, and she says in her clip that we played, Ghana is an innocent bystander that was hit, and that a country with a track record of sound economic management like Ghana ought to be supported. And the reason is simple. There's a crisis. We have been affected by it. But if we don't get ourselves out of it quickly, conditions could deteriorate a bit further. And that's why she's urging swift action. For example, one of the ways of dealing with the external creditors is through what they call the common framework. There are about two ways. One of the ways is to either come through dealing with the Paris Club plus China, India, Saudi, or you can go under the common framework. A lot of experts say don't go under the common framework because if you take some of the other countries, I think Zambia and a few other countries, when you go under the common framework, these are different creditors with different models. You never probably get to the conclusion, and you need quick action. Because if you don't have quick action, the conditions could deteriorate some more. And so when she urges, I think her urging should be understood. And I encourage you, if we have some time, to play back her clip before we end our conversation so that, all of us can follow exactly what she has said. And I'll tie that in with the other question. How close are we to a deal? I think pretty close.
Okay. So from 1 to 10, where would you say we are?
Pretty close. Okay. That is why you have heard some dates being mentioned. I share the view that maybe we should tone down on mentioning new dates. The reality is that we hoped to conclude all of this by March. We've missed it by 16 days. We had two timelines. The first one, we were ahead of the timeline. The second one, which is end of March, we've missed it by 16 days. But the assurances coming in the background give us reason to believe that we are very, very, very close.
Okay.
And sooner than later, we'll get those assurances. Have the meetings been successful so far? Yes, the spring meetings themselves have been very successful. And our side meetings with the various parties, particularly the investors, has also been very successful. Investors have very high levels of confidence in the Ghanaian economy, despite the difficulties that we are having. And they're of the view that once we get over this hump, we should learn lessons and build some robustness for the future.
Well, on Lord's question, also, I think we've been talking about it a bit, but regarding the specifics, he wants you to share exactly what is delaying the needed assurances, especially from China. Maybe briefly on that, then we can go into other questions.
Well, China is not a democracy in the sense of the word that all of us understand it. China runs a different political system, and therefore they have to go through some different levels to get their own approval, no matter the initial conversations you may have. Our understanding is that they are going through those bureaucratic levels to get the kind of approval that is required so that they can perhaps come to the table with the kind of assurances that we're able to get from them.
Okay. Yeah, let's get into the next batch. We have a number of them, so we can run quickly through all the questions that have come in so far. We have one from Hashim. He says the finance minister spoke recently in Washington and mentioned that government is looking at an end of May timeline to assess the IMF deal. Now, he spoke the next day and urged caution. What's necessitating this flip-flopping, he's asking. And Xavier says some analysts, including Dr. Theo Champong, Professor Bokping, and Lord Mensah, are all asking government to stop issuing timelines. Will the finance minister stop speaking about definite timelines? Xavier. Well, let's go in. Musbao says, is there a fear in government circles that Ghana may be like Zambia, which got a staff level agreement but struggling to get the needed external creditor assurances to move the IMF deal forward? The next one, and we have one from Samuel. It says, what do you, okay, this from Joseph. What are the current three taxes? Where are the current three taxes the Parliament passed? I assume the President has since signed them into law, and has the GRA commenced implementation, and how is it looking? So that's that question. So there's one also I'll add from Samuel. It says, what do you say to calls, first from Dr. Theo Champong and others, that even before the mid-year budget review, the government needs to present a new or varied budget to Parliament, given the current difficulties in assessing the IMF deal? So, Mr. Ponkuma, let's go through this batch quickly. So, Hashim's own, the issue about the flip-flopping. First, he spoke, and the very next day asking us to exercise some caution. What really is there?
No, so, I mean, I don't think it's flip-flopping. I think this is what some people would describe as cautious optimism. Yes, we're optimistic that it will land well, looking at the kind of conversations that have taken place so far. But I think it's also important to be cautious that we're not out of the woods yet. There's a lot of work. In fact, you know, when you get a board approval, that's not the end. That's actually the beginning of the real work. If you recall the press conference we had at the Finance Ministry when the SLA was announced, I remember mentioning in our closing remarks that there was a lot of work that needed to be done between the SLA and getting board approval. And today, time has borne us right. And actually, when we are done with the board approval, it's not the end. There now needs to be a lot of work, first of all, on getting the balance of payment supported program of the IMF, getting it right, and then getting the bigger economic recovery program right as well. So it's cautious optimism, and I think we can all take it in good faith. I think I've already commented on timelines.
Yeah.
We have had two timelines so far. One was before 31st December. We did the SLA before that. And we thank all the stakeholders, the people of Ghana, the technocrats at the Finance Ministry, Parliament, all of those who helped us get that. The second was to go before board by the end of March. We have missed that by 16 days. And as I explained earlier, because a lot of the prior actions may not exclusively be within our domain, you need other partners to come on board. You were just asking me about China and all of those other people. But thankfully, I think we are landing well.
So for these economists, for instance, maybe we should stop issuing timelines and stick to the work. then maybe when we are done, we can be giving the timelines or definite ones for that
matter.
matter.
The timelines come when you ask me questions. Remember this evening, you've asked me about 3 or 4 times, about timelines, and I have rather been cautious not to mention timelines. So, it's not like we are happy to be given timelines, but in transparency and in engaging with the media, sometimes you ask the question, and I think the finance ministry officials have shared those timelines with us. I think, to be fair, those timelines have not been very far off. We just have to ensure that we get it done moving forward. Do we have a fear that we may become like Zambia?
Exactly.
Very,
Still struggling.
We are very, very hopeful that Ghana will not be like Zambia. The taxes, I am informed, or the bills that were passed.
But back to the Zambia issue, really, what makes us so sure as a country? Because this is not really within our powers.
Yesterday, in our meeting with the IMF managing director, and I don't think this is a secret, I can share it, she made the point that one of the things that has been helpful in Ghana's case to help us to get a staff level agreement in less than 6 months, between 1st of July and 12th of December. Remember, everybody said we couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. One of the things that, according to her, has contributed to that is the speed with which we have negotiated, and more importantly, the seemingly difficult prior actions that the government and the people of Ghana have taken. And for the kind of things that we've had to do back home have not been very pleasant to anybody. But those very difficult decisions that the people of Ghana and the government of Ghana were able to put together, those who volunteered their debts to swap their old debts for new debts, those who took the necessary cuts in expenditure that were announced, those who more or less saw reason with us to help get these revenue measures through. Those very difficult decisions have contributed to Ghana's fast tracking of our negotiations. And if you compare to some of the other countries that have delayed, they have not necessarily been able to do that. And so, according to her, it is one of the things that the people of Ghana and the government of Ghana need to be commended for. And that is also why the international community is very willing and ready to help us, having seen how we are willing to.
But a while longer on the IMF managing director, really, we could all tell the excitement all the time when she's talking about Ghana, especially when questions about Ghana comes up, at least watching a few of those press conferences. And every time she's had the opportunity to talk about Ghana. The concern then is, what really is in it for the IMF? Why are they so interested in Ghana's case? I'm sure it's come up a couple of times. Maybe it's a good time to address that for us as a country. Really, why are they so interested in our case?
At the last press conference, she actually articulated it, and I just mentioned it out to you, and that's what I was asking you to play back. She said that Ghana is an innocent bystander that was hit, and that for a country with a track record of sound economic management like Ghana, we ought to be supported.
But we agree that Ghana has not been the only country hit by these economic situations in Africa, really. We are not the only country, are we?
That is true, but that's not the only thing she said. She says that for a country with a track record of sound economic management like Ghana, we ought to be helped. So if you put the two together, in answering your question, when I sit in those meetings and I hear the officials of the fund or the bank or the other organizations under the World Bank Group speak, they all make the point that Ghana has been a good example. We have challenges. It should be in the interest of everybody to help resolve those challenges.
Is the fund not worried that we've been there 17 times and they're still so interested in our case and wanting to help every time we come knocking? They're happy we come knocking all the time?
I think, one, we must remind ourselves that we are members of the fund. We contribute to all sort of things that go on here at the fund, because the fund is a group of countries that come to share common practices and lessons on how to manage economies. The fund has various levels of support for economies. One of them is the Extended Credit Facility, or the ECF, which is available when countries get into difficulties like what we have gotten into. Our difficulty, remember, is our inability to access the international capital markets. Why? Because we've been downgraded by the international credit agencies. Why? Because we were hit by a challenge And that challenge necessitated our borrowing beyond our program. Borrowing beyond program, credit ratings then scored us down. You couldn't get access to the capital markets. There's local demand for dollar to meet all sorts of necessities. And so we opted to come to the fund. In terms of the Ghanaian economy, the kind of sentiment you see from investors generally gives you the feedback that there's a lot of positive sentiment about the ability of the Ghanaian economy to bounce back, and that we need to, importantly, learn lessons from what has gone on so that we can bounce back and get on that.
So the assurance, at least, that we can give is that Ghana is not being caught up in any geopolitics whatsoever, you would say?
I think here at the fund, you have all the players at the table. You have China at the table, you have the West at the table. In the midst of all of these, and when you go to the IMF board, all of these countries are represented. The entire geopolitics of the world is represented. So even if there's geopolitics, it will be resolved at the board table. And if the world decides that Ghana should be supported, you cannot say, therefore, that it is because of geopolitics.
Okay. Well, we'll take Samuel's question on the issue about Dr. Theo Champong and others, that even before the mid-year budget review, the government needs to present a new or varied budget to Parliament, given the current difficulties in accessing the IMF deal.
Let's go back. In my answers to your questions, I said we have a bigger economic recovery program, which we announced on the 1st of July in the statement that was under my signature, under my hand. That program, the Enhanced Domestic Program, which after all the consultations we've rechristened the PCPEG, is the big program to get us out of the economic challenge in which we are. Remember, 2017, 2018, 2019, our economy was on the rise. Then we had a challenge. And following that challenge, we drew up a program called the PCPEG. The PCPEG requires 3 instruments of financing. You need CD to fund it. It's called domestic resource mobilization. You need hard currency. You would have ordinarily gone to the capital markets, but because you've been downgraded and you don't have access, that's why you need the fund to come in and give you that plug. And then you need the third level, financing from the development partners. That is the financing assurances that you are looking for, which from all intents and purposes, we are close to securing.
So you can conclude on that.
No, so if you put all of that together, you have clarity of what we are looking for at this stage. Now, if by the time we do, let's say, quarter one assessment, because remember, we've just finished quarter one, January, February, March. We've just started quarter two, April. If by the time we get midway into quarter two, there's reason to believe that, for example, domestic resource mobilization is not performing. There's reason to believe that the fund ECF is not coming through, and that the financing assurances from the development partners is not coming through. Then you have a basis to reconfigure your budget. Where we stand now, I don't think that we should look to the fund ECF or the balance of payment support only as the panacea to our problems, or as a reason for which domestic resource mobilization should not even function. So I think it's early days yet. Let's give it an opportunity to function, and then those determinations can be made.
Let's talk about the 3 taxes. It was key. You wanted it passed, at least. We heard you talk about it. But the question Joseph is asking is, he assumes that the president has assented. Really, what's the status of these 3 taxes? Take your time and then give us updates on it.
I checked with the counsel to the president, Mr. Kowe Suman, and he informs me that the president has assented to them and that it has been returned to the clerk of parliament. That's the brief I have on that as of now.
Okay, so it's been assented to as we speak. That's the status of these 3 taxes.
That is a brief I have from counsel to the president, and my information is that it has been returned to the clerk of parliament, and I'm sure they will now, get into the transmittal process so that the GRA, etc., can now start implementing.
Okay, but we don't know the timelines as to when all that will happen, so that the GRA will commence implementation.
I don't have timelines on that. It's already overdue. Remember that these were revenue measures that were mentioned in the November budget, and we delayed in getting it passed. So it is already delayed, and it may therefore be important that we fast-track implementation.
Okay. Well, let's then get into some other questions also that is coming. At least we are also checking from our social media platforms. But let's talk about does government not also want to help itself by also cutting expenditure? This is something that most economists, Ghanaians, have been talking about for some time now. You're out there asking for the support of the world. What are we doing to help ourselves as a country?
I mean, I think it is, first of all, a fair question. Secondly, I think it's also fair to remind ourselves that already some cuts have taken place. In addition to those cuts, I think it is also fair to continuously examine where some further cuts can take place. I have never attended any meeting in government where anybody has said that our eyes and our ears are closed to making any further cuts. From what I know, government is very open to any further cuts that it can do to ensure that pressures on expenditure are held in abeyance. But for example, Emefa, we are the same people who are asking for some more public sector jobs. We are the same people, and that is item 1. We are the same people who are asking for the budgetary allocations of ministries to be released so that they can deliver on the social contract that we have. That's item 2. We are the same people who are asking for more roads in our constituencies. That's item 3, capital expenditure. We are the same people who are asking for exemptions from the DDEP, which go into the interests or the debt servicing bucket. So in one breath, we are all agreeing that government should, as much as possible, look to ways by which it can cut on its expenditure commitments. In another breath, we are all demanding our share of the national cake. So that balance is what government needs to strike, and I think that a continuous examination will get us there.
I think as part of expenditure cut, I don't know if briefly, as at the year 2023, what kinds of savings we've been able to make when we talk about the fact that government has cut expenditure, how much really have we made from that? Do we know?
I think the 2023 outturns will come out in first quarter 2024. I think that's when the outturns will come out. I think the outturns for 2022 are now about coming out from the finance ministry. That's first quarter 2023. And it will give us a real sense of, in terms of nominals, how much has been saved. But you can just look at the deficit as a guide. Did we exceed the deficit, or did we stay within deficit despite the fact that revenue underperformed? And I think that the data speaks for itself, that despite the fact that revenue underperformed, total revenue underperformed, we did not exceed the deficit for the year 2022. So while we are looking at the nominals, which will be coming out at the end of quarter 1, already you can see that indication that we have not gone beyond the bar.
Okay. With the team currently at the spring meeting, how many are we able to tell? As part of cuts, we want to know how many of us are in Washington, D.C. For these meetings, which are mostly virtual.
I think that, no, it's not true that these meetings are mostly virtual. That is not correct. A lot of these meetings are in person. So I don't think that's a new dynamic we should introduce. I know the Minister of Finance himself is leading the team. I know the Minister of State for Finance came in briefly, he's gone back to Accra. I have been here supporting the Minister from, I think, the 4th day or so on a number of specifics. And then there's a technical team of about 3 directors from the ministry, the Director of Debt, the Chief Economist, the 2 of them, and then the Director of the Financial Sector who are here.
Okay. Well, there's an issue on the principal repayment for these loans. We know that they've all been put off till after 2024.
Which loan are you talking about?
So that's most of them we are told about. Measures that are in place for the country to meet the debt sustainability by 2028, for instance. Really, it appears that most of these loans that we're taking, we will not pay until 2028, amongst others. The concern is it appears that government may be shaking that responsibility for those who will come after this particular government to take up.
So I think either way you look at it, we cannot talk about a shirking of responsibility in the sense that government will still have to pay what it owes. The question is, how much do you pay in a particular year, looking at the revenues that are coming in? You have old contracts that put expenditure obligations on you. How much of it can you settle, looking at the inflows that are coming in? And it is the adjustment of how much you can settle in a year that government has been discussing with the various categories of creditors. So I don't think it's a shirking of responsibility, or it's a decision by government not to pay. Government will pay. It happens that this is a time when these conversations are going on and this restructuring is taking place. And so there's been a suspension at this time when these conversations are taking place. The expectation is that when it is done and the debts have been exchanged for new debts at new terms that enable government to match its expenditure commitments with its inflows, then there will be a full resumption of those payments moving forward.
Okay, so if you recall, as part of the DDE, bondholders, together with the finance ministry, there was a technical team that was put together, I think about 7-member technical committee, and they came up with some recommendations to government as part of how we can make some savings and then also make the DDE successful. Really, where is that particular recommendation? We've been talking about it for some time now. Is there a roadmap for actually implementing those recommendations?
Yes, you will recall that the original set of new debts that were published by the Ministry of Finance are not the ones that have been settled on. The very original one that was published had to go through a rigorous process of adjustments, and new ones were issued, I think, 3 or 4 times before the settlement, the final settlement. A lot of that work, those adjustments, were informed by the recommendations of this committee of experts that was put together to advise the Ministry of Finance.
Okay.
That enabled the ministry also negotiate better with the various categories of creditors to adjust those original, may I say, debts that were offered as new debts in exchange for the old debts. So those recommendations, though they were not made public, my understanding is that have been factored into the thinking of the finance ministry, and that is what is translated into the new debt instruments that were issued, which were then, I think, about 85% subscribed by the various categories of debt holders or creditors.
So pensions exemptions, now we're told is back, really. What was the explanation there?
I was at a press conference with the minister a couple of days ago, and this question came up, and he explained. And so I'm going to repeat to you exactly what the minister said. The minister explained that the domestic debt exchange program, as was announced, with the terms that were announced, is closed. That closure included the exemption of the pensioners. There was an MOU that was signed with the pensioners that says that they will not be part of that, but that they will examine ways by which, between them and government, they can come up with other instruments that will help government solve the same problem it wants to solve, but without disadvantaging the pensioners, as the envisaged was being done in the domestic debt exchange program. And the minister explained that what they are doing now is engaging with the pensioners pursuant to that MOU, that can we look at a new way of helping government solve its original problem without disadvantaging you in a manner that you envisaged was being disadvantaged in the first one. And that is the kind of conversation that was, or that is going on, alongside the other conversation of dealing with the cocoa and then the dollar bonds. That is a conversation that they are having with the pensioners. That was the explanation that the minister gave in his press briefing a couple of days ago. In fact, tonight he has another press briefing with the Ghanaian media and other press houses that are here. And already we've received a lot of questions to that effect. And I think that some more engagement will help clear it up.
Okay. Well, Mimi has a question, and she says a key concern is government's expenditure. There are hints that cutting down on expenditure and size of government is on the table. Is that correct? As part of talk with our external creditors, has it come up? Government size, has it come up?
No, not that I am privy to. I haven't heard that come up in any of our meetings with external creditors so far. But I answered you earlier by saying that I've never been to a meeting of the government of Ghana where it has been said that the doors are closed to any possible ways of cutting expenditure.
If the doors are not closed, when exactly are we seeing action, especially with government size?
There has already been action. I've already mentioned to you that, in fact, you asked that, so what are the outcomes for 2022? And I reminded you of the timelines, that the timelines are now due for the numbers to come out. There's already been action on various levels. And I've mentioned that the doors are not closed to further cuts as are being examined. And as we go through and as we examine some more, if there are places where some more cuts can be done, it makes sense to make those cuts.
But as in the number of ministers, that we are not going to see any, cut reduction in that size. Are we ever going to see that?
The understanding I have is that Parliament does not even share that view.
The Parliament does not share the view that the number of ministers should be reduced?
No.
How so?
You saw what happened in Parliament the last time. Literally, that question was put on the table. Despite all the conversations, the last time it was put on the table, you saw the numbers. So Parliament as a body does not even share that view. But as I've mentioned, and listen, the reason that Parliament doesn't share that view, for example, I am a Minister of State. I don't get paid 1 cedi as a Minister of State. I get paid as a Member of Parliament. So whether I was a minister or not, my cost to the Ghanaian Republic will not change. And a good number of these ministers that are spoken about are members of Parliament. It doesn't cost the taxpayer any extra because they are paid as members of Parliament. This is very different from the previous scenario where you had persons who were being paid as members of Parliament and at the same time being paid as ministers of state. But I don't want to get into those arguments which sometimes get partisan, etc. Number one, some cuts have been made. Number two, the doors are not closed, and any opportunity to do some cuts, I think it makes sense that government will respond to those opportunities.
Okay. Ms. Oponkuma, at this point, we'll leave it here, and we look forward to that press conference also to be held by the Finance Minister. George, we are faced there for us, so we'll definitely bring you live updates. But maybe a word or two from Washington just before we go.
Yeah, I think that we have to commend the Ghanaian people for keeping faith with the government, even in these very difficult times, and even for some of the very difficult decisions that have had to be made by the government. I think the global community is very commending that because of these steps, the world is able to rally behind us quickly and support us. We have to hold government accountable to, one, an implementation of the BOP support program, and two, the broader implementation of the economic recovery program. We have to all then also find out what is our various roles in helping the Ghanaian economy recover and rise up to that role. And I think that together we can get our economy back onto those high heights before we were hit by these challenges.
Ms. Oponkuma is Ghana's Information Minister. I am Emefa Apawu, and that's it for tonight's edition of The Probe. There's more when you log on to myjoyonline.com. For our radio audience, A Walk with Jesus, it's up next. Have a good evening.